Thank you for joining today's executive session where I discuss the American Rescue Plan, which included $167 billion for education overall and $122 billion specifically for K-12. I'm Doug Meskar, and you are now in session. Thank you, Adam. Excited to dig in. Chloe, if you go to the next slide briefly. So Adam just covered this, but Adam, our managing partner at Strategos, you can see all of our qualifications there. Tom and I will take you through the bulk of this, and I'm going to hit some history, some background, talk about the American Rescue Plan, and then we will talk about implications. So Chloe, if you go to the next slide. But first I want to start with, and you can see here what we're going to cover. We're going to start with learning loss just to frame up some of this discussion and some of the provisions that I'll talk about in the American Rescue Plan. We'll talk about all the stimulus that's happened over the last year. We'll talk a little bit about the CRSA, just as a reminder. The American Rescue Plan, we can't forget that there's regular appropriations happening as well. And then finally, the landscape analysis. So Chloe, if you'll take us into the next slide on learning loss. Perfect, and one more. So some of you may have seen this data. I was, looking at different data sources. This is Brookings by way of NWEA. And these charts are meant to show the solid lines are typical sort of learning trajectories and learning loss. Those are the solid lines. The dotted lines are showing, based on the data from NWEA, the projected learning loss. So those dotted lines in both reading and in math. And you can see math is actually a little bit bigger of a learning loss as you look at this over time. And this is sort of their data, their projections for the students that they have data for. And Chloe, if we go to the next slide, there is some more detail level data, or particularly around low-income students, students of color. And you can see on this slide, this data is courtesy of McKinsey. They're drawing on some data from Curriculum Associates and iReady. But Black and Hispanic students twice as likely as white students to have no live access to teachers during the pandemic. So obviously that's going to have an impact. So as we start to dig into specific groups of students, particularly our low-income students, our students of color, the impact on learning loss is worse, much worse in some cases. So Chloe, if we can go to the next slide. So as we think about their access to teachers, we also want to look at how much further they're falling behind. As you saw in those initial slides, there's clearly learning loss happening across the board. This slide gets into a little bit more detail, whereas you see on the far right with the blue dots, there's learning loss, for reading, for math, for all students. But if you look on the left where the black dot is, that represents schools with 50% or greater number or percentage of students of color. And so you see pretty dramatic differences there, 10, 20 point percentage differences in the learning loss that they're showing in some of this data from iReady. And then the last slide on learning loss, just to frame this up. So what does this mean? What do these percentages mean? Chloe, if you go to the next slide, please. So quantifying it in terms of how many months behind. So students of color, we're talking about a year, almost to a year and a half further behind than white students. You'll see here about a half a year behind to maybe, 3/4 of a year. And then overall about 10 months worth of learning loss. Now, I know learning loss isn't necessarily the term that everybody's using these days, but that is the term that they use in the American Rescue Plan. So for the purposes of this discussion, just focusing on, obviously there's learning loss across the board, but it's more dramatic for our low-income students and our students of color. And so this really sets the stage for some of our further conversation about the stimulus funding that's happened. So let's first review where we've been. So Chloe, if you go to the next slide. And what we're going to do here is look at, okay, so in context, the CARES Act, $31 billion. enacted, March of last year, so just shy of a year ago. The Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations, or the CRRSA, which just rolls off the tongue. So 82 billion enacted in December of last year. And then finally, the American Rescue Plan, $167 billion for education. So when you look at these three, these are the education totals. The date of enactment there on the right, you can see when they were enacted, but maybe even more importantly, when do these funds need to be obligated? Not necessarily fully spent, but obligation means in federal speak, there has to be a plan or a contract, some sort of obligation against the funds, even if the dollars haven't left the account, there's a plan for spending those. And so you can see this stair step. CARES Act need to be obligated by September 30th of 2022. The Coronavirus Response and Relief Appropriation, September of 2023. And then finally, the American Rescue Plan 1 year later. So they've tried to soften the funding cliff that is inevitably going to come with this large amount of money. Now, if you add up these dollars, that's almost $200 billion over the course of the last year for education from the feds. It's a huge amount of money flowing into the system, but they're also trying to, not create that use it or lose it funding cliff. We'll return back to this slide later, but that just gives you a sense of the time frame in which these dollars need to be obligated and then ultimately spent. So Chloe, if you'll go to the next slide, please. So as we dig into these numbers a little bit more, you can see two charts here. On the left, when we just look at the funding totals, so the American Rescue Plan, we've gone through these numbers, but it just gives you a sense of size. On the right, as we look into the individual uses of these dollars, so the ESSER fund, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, right? There's been three versions of this fund. The first one in CARES had 13 billion. The second one in the CRRSA had 54 billion. And then in the third one in the American Rescue Plan, 123 billion. So you can see the growth in the dollars that are going to K-12. In contrast to that, the GEAR fund, or the governor's fund, has been steadily going down from 3 to 1.3, and then there was no GEAR funds in the American Rescue Plan. The Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools Fund, however, started with 0 with CARES, and then it got 2.75, or rounded up to 2.8 billion here in this chart, 2.8 billion in the CRRSA, and then 2.8 billion in the American Rescue Plan. And then you can see higher ed is going up, as well as the broadband in each of the three bills. So it started out with 0, went to 3, and now it was at 7 in the American Rescue Plan. So this just gives you a bigger sort of picture of what's in each of these three according to the funds. And there's there's great consistency between each of the bills and how these funds can be used, but there are a few differences. So let's dig into some of those. So Chloe, if you go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit. We can't forget the CRRSA is still out there, right? It passed in December, 54 billion in ESSER funds, 22 billion for higher ed, 4 billion for governors. Of course, out of that governor's fund came the emergency assistance for non-public schools, that 2.75 billion. And that was the first time this existed. Now, it's true, though, that not every district has even received these dollars, let alone the American Rescue Plan dollars. So it depends on the state. In some states, these dollars are now sitting in district budgets, ready to be obligated. In other states, for reasons that I think Tom may talk about later, the state legislatures weren't in session during CARES. They were in session when these dollars from the CRRSA came available. And so they've wanted to play a role. But these dollars should start hitting district budgets either soon or within the next couple of weeks, certainly by the end of April. So most districts will know their allocation, how much money they should be getting. It's just a matter of pushing those monies down to the district at this point. Now, in terms of the size of these dollars, some analysts said that the CRRSA dollars represented about $1,000 per student. Now, remember, these dollars flow on Title I formula. So not every district is going to be receiving stimulus funds. That's true for CARES, true for CRRSA, and true for the American Rescue Plan. So when we talk about $1,000 per student, that's in districts that have Title I students that are receiving Title I dollars. And then again, approximately, this is an average, so this is going to be different depending on the district, but about 8% addition to a district's budget. So those are pretty sizable numbers, and they also set the context for the American Rescue Plan. So let's go ahead, Chloe, and go to the next slide. And one more. There you go. So when we talk about the American Rescue Plan, people are calling it ESSER 3, right? Because CARES Act had ESSER 1, CRRSA, ESSER 2, and now the American Rescue Plan, ESSER 3. As we talked about before, $123 billion. That is a huge chunk of change. This bill obviously was just enacted, signed into law. So these dollars have not yet flowed from the feds to the states or even down locally. They will, and they'll move pretty quickly, partly because they're using the same sort of funding formula and allocation. So Chloe, if you click again. So these are based on Title I, how much a district and a state is getting their proportionate share of Title I. Same process of 90% of these dollars have to go down to districts, 10% can be held at the state level. Now, before I go further, I do want to point out two quick things. That sub-bullet there. So out of the $123 billion, $800 million is actually set aside for homeless education. As you all well know, there have been a lot of students that have become homeless because of the pandemic. There's also been a lot of students who we think are homeless, but we're not sure. So the amount of money that actually goes down to the states and the districts is about 122 billion because the 800 million comes out of that. Now, in contrast, there is an additional 3 billion for IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So these are additional dollars. So if you want to actually add that to the total, it's 126 billion that is going to states and locals, but the 3 billion for IDEA goes through the normal IDEA formula. So about 2.6 billion of the IDEA money is for state grants, right? That's the Part B funding. And then there's some money for the other parts of IDEA. So huge chunk of change, specific money for homeless and IDEA. Okay, so once these dollars, the 122 billion, keep that number in mind. So what can the states and the districts do with these dollars? This is a big change now. Before I get to that though, let's put this in context. About $2,500 per pupil. So CRRSA was $1,000. This is $2,500. So that would be $3,500 per pupil, again, on average between these two bills. If you add in CARES at about $250 per pupil, we're talking about $3,750 to $4,000 extra dollars per pupil, about a 20% boost for your typical district. Again, if you add that to CARES, you're talking about almost a 30% boost to district budgets. One key difference here is that the American Rescue Plan has some very strong maintenance of effort, and they've added a new phrase called maintenance of equity. And basically what this is getting at is that states and districts need to maintain their spending as they did prior to the pandemic as a condition of receiving these dollars. And one of the reasons they did that is there's a few states out there. Texas did this with CARES Act money. They talked about doing it with CRRSA, and New York has talked about offsetting the state money with federal money, basically creating a zero-sum game. So in the American Rescue Plan, they're trying to sort of eliminate that possibility and say, as a condition of receiving these dollars, you need to maintain your spending at pre-pandemic levels so that this doesn't become an offsetting situation. Now, the maintenance of equity deals with specific provisions around how the maintenance of effort affects high poverty districts in particular. I'm not going to go into those details now. What you need to know is this requirement that you maintain spending for state level spending as well as different district level spending. So what can they do with these dollars? Here's a major change. So Chloe, click again if you would. So the set-asides. So this is new. At the SEA level, of the 10% of the money they receive, they have to use 5% for learning loss. So specifically addressing academic, but they also expanded to include social and emotional learning. So if you think about this number in total, it's about $6 billion that SEAs need to spend addressing learning loss. This is a huge, huge new requirement, and different than the prior bills. But they also include a 1% set aside for summer learning, and then an additional 1% set aside for after school. So when you total up those amounts, that's another 2.4 billion for summer learning and for after school, on top of other learning loss activities. So these are big numbers that states need to set aside, but it's even bigger at the district level. So when districts receive their money, they have to set aside 20% for these same activities on learning loss. Again, academic plus the social and emotional pieces. So as these dollars hit the states and hit the districts, you're going to see a renewed emphasis, or maybe not renewed isn't the right word, an increasing emphasis on addressing learning loss. How they're going to do that is going to vary. But Tom, I want to bring you into the conversation here to talk a little bit about everything I've said to this point, but also specific to this slide around, from your perspective, former state chief, how you're thinking about this from your state chief experience, as well as any insights that you can provide as you've interacted across the country over the last few months around the stimulus dollars.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and great work. I think this information is very timely for any state chief, and even at the local level, the superintendents and the decisions that will have to be made. I think one of the most significant things that you've mentioned, Doug, and it's kind of nuanced or wonkish, and so I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time, but maintenance of equity, that is maybe even a game changer, because of if you know anything about maintenance of effort, it's kind of complicated, but it's something that the federal government watches and monitors very closely, about supplanting or supplementing, and the difference between the two. And so I think maintenance of equity is going to be, as states learn more about what that means and how to meet that requirement, I think that's going to affect a lot of the decisions and timing of decisions. I think without going into a whole lot of detail, because I think we're going to go into more detail going forward, but the focus now on learning loss, some are referring to it as accelerated learning, and kids aren't less smart than they were the last day of school. It's just they haven't learned, as they've lost learning opportunities, and how do we get them back up? So all these dollars are being made available. How do you measure that to demonstrate that you are addressing learning loss? How do you use the tools and the monies that have been spent previously in digital connectivity, digital curriculum, digital learning to and use those tools going forward? Are some of the questions and that are being asked, and that states and districts are going to be looking for solutions to. And then you just can't ignore the fact that it's just a tremendous amount of money, and the capacity to spend that effectively is going to be a big lift at the local and state level. So I'll have more to say about details as we go forward, but those are some things that I think when we look at this last funding that's on its way, or I should say this next funding that's on its way, there's some changes to it that are significant compared to the previous rounds of funding.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And that actually is a nice lead in, Chloe, to the next slide. So uses of funds. So beyond these set asides, these should all be very familiar to you. So all the uses of funds that were previously allowed under the CARES Act and under CRSA for these funds, still in play, right? And these funds can be used for any authorized activities under ESSA, IDEA, the Adult Family and Education Literacy Act, Perkins, CTE, McKinney-Vento homeless. So all of that is still in place. So when we talk about the funds outside of these set-asides, same types of things. So it can be used for, health and safety reasons, can be used for lots of other purposes, up to and including, right, backfilling budget holes, whether that be on backfilling, costs that they're incurring as a part of their regular business. That could be salaries, right? It could be, or it could be other expenses that are related to the pandemic or that they need to cover as part of their opening and reopening, which I want to just touch on that. So in the Senate consideration, there's not a requirement that you reopen, but there is this study, or this reporting, I should say, that they put in place that basically says, hey, you need to tell us when you're going to start reopening for in-person instruction. Now, I know school districts have been open and they've been doing distance learning, so don't get me wrong. What they're focused on, though, at the congressional level is reopening for in-person instruction. And so there's a requirement here that plans be made public about what that looks like. Again, these funds are going to flow regardless of what the plan is. It's just that you have to have a plan. So that's a little bit of a new wrinkle as well